For September. Right, we have apologies from Councillor Brewer, Deputy Chairperson Councillor Clough, Deputy Mayor Councillor Penrose, Councillor Wood, and lateness for Councillor Quacks and Cooper. I'll move those apologies. John Watson sitting in front of me right now. Councillor and I. Thank you. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Declarations of interest. There were no declarations. Oh yes, there is a declaration of interest from Councillor and I on item number 13. Thank you. Any other declarations of interest? No. Confirmation of minutes of the 20th of August.
Happy to move. Thank you.
Moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by Councillor Philippina. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. There are no petitions, no public input. I had one local board request from member Bergen, who wanted to come and tell us what a very good job we were doing. I reluctantly said it probably wasn't necessary at that stage, but it was always nice to have local board chairs telling us we're doing a good job. And a request from Paul Malden from Waiheke. However, he's going to come to next month's meeting, so thank you. There's no notice of motion or extraordinary business, but we do have to move precedent of business for item 15, which we are going to bring forward. That's seconded by Councillor Fletcher. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. So, right, councillors, we will move to item 15. I'd like to invite Paul Callow to the table. Paul is an ex-partner of Deloitte's and led their infrastructure sector group for 12 years. He is now providing independent consulting advice, and this was, as you remember, a request from some councillors for a comparison document to be done independently on the rail costs between Auckland. Well timed.
Should we get a cuppa? ATS Centre.
Someone doesn't like this recording. Anyone would like to leave the room? Just to practice. Introducing Paul. So, and as I said, this independent review was requested during the LTP deliberations by a few councillors, so that's why we have it on the agenda for today. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, can we get my presentation up on the screen for... Well, the alarm trick didn't work, so I guess I'll have to do the presentation after all. Okay, my name's Paul Callow. I'm an independent consultant. I was engaged by Auckland Council to review the rail costs in Auckland, compare them with the costs for Wellington, and also to look at the funding and fares recovery ratios and the differences in those between the two cities. The report, I understand, has been circulated to the committee. So the purpose of this presentation is just to provide a brief summary of the key points in the report and an opportunity for the councillors to ask questions, should they have any. So very briefly, agenda, I'll just run through the scope of the review, my terms of reference, the key findings, talk briefly about the network and service comparison that sits behind the work that I did, the financial analysis that supports that, and then the fares and funding analysis, that was a slightly separate exercise, and then a few recommendations that came out of the work that I did. So the review is based, first important thing to notice, is based on 2014 financial year, the reason being, that's the year to June 2014. The reason for that being, that was the most recent information that was available for both cities at the time the review was carried out. Compares the networks and, more importantly, the services run over those networks in the two cities. I was asked to develop financial metrics to establish and compare the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the delivery of services between the two cities. I then also looked at the differences in funding between the two cities, which is essentially a close look at the fares policies between the two, because essentially the fare cover is driven by the fares you set, the balance being met by a mixture of NZTA and rates funding. So the scope of so first of all, the key conclusions, get straight to the point. Auckland runs a more comprehensive service timetable than Wellington, and it services more stations at a greater frequency. When I talk about the services in more detail, I'll explain what's behind that. But essentially, Auckland runs more trains to more stations more often, and clearly there's a cost to that, which is the primary driver of the difference in costs between Auckland and Wellington, and that is essentially labour, maintenance, and in the case of 2014, fuel costs. Auckland also has lower fares than Wellington. The fare structures are very similar, but the actual fare outcomes, the average fare per head, is much lower, and I'll explain the reasons for that in the rest of the presentation. There are also a number of other factors which were not present in Auckland, which weren't present in Wellington, some of which will persist and some of which won't. I'll just run through what those are as well. They were more aggravating factors than the primary cause of the higher expense in Auckland. Adjusting for the differences in service levels and adjusting for the factors present in Auckland, I'll take you through what those adjustments were. There's really no material difference in the cost effectiveness of delivery of services in Auckland versus Wellington. The reason for the extra cost is you deliver more of them to more stations in Auckland than Wellington. And also those cost effectiveness measures will improve significantly in Auckland in 2016, being the first year of full EMU operation. So things are going to get considerably better. So briefly, let's have a look at the networks. The networks are remarkably similar. Both have 4 lines serving a single central terminus. One of those lines in each city is essentially a branch of one of the major lines, and both have 2 lines that carry the bulk of the traffic, which I'll talk about in a minute. The number of stops is very similar, 49 versus 42. The only major difference is the overall length of the Wellington network is about 40% greater than the overall length of the Auckland network, which is slightly more compact, so distance between stops is slightly less in Auckland versus Wellington. But other than that, it would be hard to find two more similar networks to compare. The major difference is the services that are run on those networks, which is the main driver of cost. So just looking at Wellington first, the two busiest lines are the Paraparaumu line and the Hutt Valley line, and the service patterns on those through the morning peak, which is the main driver of the financial outcomes for the rail service, are essentially in two halves. There's one service, what they call an express service, that serves the outer half of the stations and then provides a non-stopping service from halfway into Wellington. And then there's a stopping service, which is much shorter, which basically picks up, just runs back and forth along the inner half of the line. Essentially, those are at best 20-minute frequency during the peak period, and slightly less in some cases. And so the services are shorter and effectively run in two halves. Contrast that with Auckland, and just looking at the two main lines being the western and the southern, every service stops at every station, and the services run through the peak on a 15-minute frequency, and that's going to change to expected to change to a 10-minute frequency once the EMUs are commissioned. So you're stopping at all stations on every line, and you're running a 15-minute frequency. So clearly, you need more trains, more people to do that, and that's clearly that's what drives the major difference in cost between the two cities. So, looking at the other factors that were present in Auckland, which were not present in Wellington, the first one is a thing called dead running. And dead running is basically the time cost of moving trains from where they're stored overnight to the place where they start service in the morning. In Auckland, you have depots at Wirri and Westfield, which are halfway along the line. So before you can start service in the morning, you've got to move the train into the central terminus or out, or in some cases, into the central terminus and out along one of the lines that doesn't have a depot situated along it. In Wellington, there is no dead running. Essentially, all the trains are stabled at the main terminus, and some of those train repositioning services are actually run as timetabled services. So if you look at the Wellington timetables, if you want to go from Wellington out to the end of the Hutt Valley line at 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, you're actually quite well served. There's an express service, which is actually a train repositioning movement. So night watchmen and shift workers are very well served. I'm not sure it's a terribly heavily patronised service. Fleet age, clearly during 2014, Auckland was operating a very elderly fleet of diesels and of refurbished carriages of relatively old design. That had two factors. One is the age creates a maintenance burden, and the second is diesels are inherently more expensive to maintain than electric EMUs, as we're finding with the EMUs that are being introduced. Train capacity, Auckland's fleet is in 2014 was of generally quite an old design, configured for 66 seats in a carriage versus the EMUs in Wellington that are 78, and the new EMUs here I think are something similar. So essentially to provide a given capacity you have to provide more carriages, which clearly creates a cost burden certainly in terms of maintenance. I also had a close look at staffing practices between the two cities, and despite the fact that there are differences around ticket collection, the overall staffing practices on trains are not materially different. So the reason for having a much higher staffing cost in Auckland versus Wellington is not because you've got more people on the trains, it's because you're running more services. In order to make a fair comparison between the two, I started with the memorandum for 18th of February that went to the board. There were a number of corrections that, or adjustments that were made to that number, both that and the Wellington numbers. The Wellington numbers included internal staff costs of somewhere over 7 million. So those were removed. The Auckland numbers didn't include internal staff costs, so the Wellington numbers came down. The Auckland numbers, there was a double count of security costs which was adjusted for. There were also ticketing costs which were included in Wellington's number but not in the Auckland numbers, so the Auckland numbers were increased by the ticketing costs. And the Auckland numbers also included a interest charge which was a capital nature, and what we were looking at purely was operational costs here, which was backed out. So that got you to 131 versus 0.5 versus 77.8, like for like, counting the same things as far as we're able to identify them. Then what I did was I took the 2014 costs, and what I tried to do was back out the transitional issues. 2014 was a year in which Auckland Transport was introducing a new fleet and was running a diesel fleet versus an electric fleet in Wellington. So what I've done is corrected for those, and that correction is probably conservative in as much as there were probably other costs I couldn't identify that didn't back out. There were several items there. The first was obviously diesel costs, so I backed the cost of diesel out, so we're comparing like with like. I backed out the cost of 18 drivers under training who were training to run the EMUs, which was a transitional issue in that year, and also backed out $1 million from the driver roster. Talking to the operator, they have to carry extra drivers because at the time 2 different diesel fleets were being run, and the drivers couldn't operate both, couldn't move from one to the other, and they estimate they carried about an extra $1 million of cost in that. So backing those out, that effectively gets said that like for like, if you were running a reasonably modern fleet, electric fleet, in a steady state in Auckland in 2014, it would have cost you about 114 million, like for like with Wellington. Then what I did was develop efficiency measures. Now the main drivers of cost in rail services are the provision of services themselves. So your costs are your staff to drive the train, your staff to collect tickets, the maintenance of the trains, and the kilometres run, which drives your maintenance costs. So it's basically hours, number of services, and kilometres run. Passengers do not drive your operating costs to any major extent. More passengers means you incur some additional cleaning and minor operational costs, but you have to. If you decide to run a schedule, you run that schedule whether you've got 1 passenger or whether you've got 11 million. So what I've tried to do in terms of measuring the efficiency is saying what drives the costs and how are you performing against those measures. So I then took the adjusted costs, divided them by the weekly operating hours, and came up with a cost which was around about 7% difference between Auckland and Wellington, and that's probably the most reliable efficiency measure because those hours include all the dead running hours, which is about 5% of your total hours. The weekly services, I actually adjusted the service base in Wellington because clearly a 22-minute service that only serves 7 stations is not equivalent to 1-for-1 with a 1-hour service that serves all the stations, all 18 stations on a line. And on a service equivalent basis, the difference looks quite large there, but what I wasn't unable to do was I didn't put in any service measures for the dead running, and there are about 16,000 train movements which are dead running. If you treat each of those as a half service, which I think is reasonably conservative, so you're saying it runs half the length of the line in cost terms, then that difference falls to around about 7%. So those first 2 measures suggest that within the limits of the accuracy of what we're able to do, there's no material difference between the efficiency of provision and the cost of provision of services and operating hours. Seat kilometres is there is a reasonably significant difference. That is largely down to the fact that the configuration of the Auckland fleet, which we couldn't adjust for, is pretty old. I mean, they're all UK carriages that have been refurbished, as I understand, and so you need to run more of them. So that measure is not a particularly reliable indicator of the relative efficiency of provision, and that will change significantly when the new EMU fleet is fully operational, and will probably fall below. Is forecast to fall below the Wellington number. The second part of the engagement was funding and fares, and so I looked at the headline numbers. The Auckland fares, the average fare per passenger, revenue divided by number of passengers, was 372, about 40% higher than Auckland. Now, there was a number of reasons that could be the case. Differences in fare structures, which I looked at, measurement differences, and a point to note there is Auckland HOP data actually enables very accurate measurement of patronage. You know exactly how many paying passengers have travelled from where and to where, so that was very useful in this exercise. Wellington still uses station blockades and passenger counts, which used to be used in Auckland. When Auckland compared its blockade data with its HOP data, it found that the blockade data was overestimating patronage by a reasonably significant amount. And I just Wellington claimed theirs is accurate. What I would say is take the opportunity to thank the Wellington guys who were very helpful in providing information for this this study. They took me through the publicly available information, and they also provided additional information which was extremely helpful. Fare evasion, depending very much on how you treat fare evaders, could be a reason for the difference, or essentially differences in fare levels. The table at the bottom there just takes you through the differences in fare revenues, and Auckland's is significantly lower for the same number of passengers. The reason, as I mentioned in the up front in the key points, is the fare structures are actually very similar. They're distance-based sections. The difference in terms of fare outcomes and average fares is that in Wellington it's not physically possible to do a commuting journey of 1 or 2 sections. So what happens is the same fare structure ends up with quite different average fare outcomes. The services on 3 of the 4 lines actually don't stop in a 1 or 2 section stop, because there aren't any, or there's one and they don't stop at it. So essentially what that does is put a floor on the fares for almost all the Wellington lines for the commuter services of around $5.50. Whereas in Auckland, what you have is a very short trip network. You have almost 1 million trips of 1 or 2 sections, a lot of which are between Newmarket and Britomart. And when you look at the average fares on your eastern and southern and western lines, you've got an average fare of about $6. On the Kapiti line, because of that floor, you end up with an average fare of $9, which is about 55% higher. Yeah. And on the Hutt Valley, you've got a fare of around $7.90, which is around 35% higher. And that's the bulk of your commuter traffic. So you can see there the actual fare itself is the main reason for the difference in revenues. You've got the difference in revenues is about 40%. The difference in your average fares through the commuter period is around about the same. So briefly, conclusions. As I've mentioned already, Auckland runs a more comprehensive timetable, more services to more stations than Wellington, and is going to continue to increase. And that's the primary driver of operational costs, the provision of trains, the provision of services, and the time they take to run. The primary reason for the lower fares is that the fares are lower. The fare levels are lower. It's not a structural issue. It's not an evasion issue. The average fares are around about 40% lower, and the average revenue is about the same difference. There is certainly greater scope for evasion in Auckland than Wellington, given there are quite different fare practices or fare improvement practices, and that I've talked about in my recommendations. Although there's undoubtedly evasion in both cities, that's not the primary material factor in the difference in revenues and consequently fare recoveries between the 2 cities. And bear in mind that a lot of those fare evaders, some of whom I had the pleasure to meet when travelling around the network here, actually haven't got any money. There does seem to be a rather strange culture where people seem to travel around on the train because they've got nothing much else to do.
We should shout them. Train spotting cigarettes.
You are shouting them at the moment by the provision of the train service, I guess, because it's treated as a free good by people with nothing much else to do. And my sense is that if you put in place a meaningful penalty for free riding, then these people would just disappear. So in that sense, it's not lost revenue, but it is a bad example. I'll come to that in the conclusions. And I guess the point is Auckland has invested a significant amount in both its fleet and the infrastructure around the network in the expectation that patronage is going to increase. And the most important thing really is to make sure that patronage does increase and monitor that quite closely. And effectively you're investing in a service pattern that's expected to drive greater levels of patronage. So just briefly coming to the recommendations, strictly speaking this wasn't part of the brief, but I was asked to share any good practice or useful points that I came across that I thought might be helpful as pointers that could be shared to help improve the financials of the network up here. The first one is levels of discount to HOP customers. The biggest discounts are actually on the shortest fares. So whilst your one section fare is $2.50, most people only pay $1.80 because you give them a 30% discount. Once people get onto a new product, they tend to be quite sticky, so as long as it remains cheaper than buying a paper ticket, they would likely continue to use it. The question is whether those discount levels remain appropriate, having got through that establishment period and got quite high levels of hop card adoption. Third-party revenues, the station infrastructure in Britomart and other parts of the network is quite modern here compared to Auckland, to Wellington. And the retail footprints in the Wellington main station are quite different to up here and probably drive greater value. That's certainly something I think would be worth looking at, the ability of third-party revenues to offset some of your costs. I think there's probably room for improvement there. The role of the train manager, it's a kind of an unusual role. It's present in both Wellington and Auckland, but you don't see it on other trains. Including that, within that role, ticket inspection would seem to me to be a low-cost way of helping to reduce revenue leakage and improve enforcement. But if you're going to enforce, you really need something to enforce. And I think establishing some meaningful penalties for what is essentially theft or fraud in some form would be sensible. As I understand at the moment, the only thing you can do is throw them off the train if they'll actually leave, and try to impose a penalty fare if you can actually persuade them to pay it. So it's pretty toothless compared to some other networks in London Underground, for example. If you're caught evading fares, you go to jail.
Okay.
Which I'm sure...
You've got no money anyway.
No, but you can always lock them up, though, I suppose.
You must have interviewed them.
I did. Well, they interviewed me, actually. It's a very interesting conversation. But they clearly weren't going to be paying for anything anytime soon. And they also gave me some hints on how to avoid fares myself, which I haven't.
Keep me clear of the retail section.
Well, apparently, it was an interesting point that the roving ticket inspectors do wear bright fluorescent vests, and they're very easy to spot. So what these guys did was just basically sit on the station until the train came past with no fluoro vests in it, and they just got on it because they knew that the train manager wasn't going to do anything. And when they saw fluoro vests at the next station, they got off. Like I said, it's a game, really. So making them, there's a number of things that could be done there to basically get these people off the network, because they're providing some bad press if nothing else. So that's really a summary of my report.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take any questions if that's the way this works.